Hello, and welcome to today's web seminar, Mobile Testing in an Agile Environment, Weighing Your Options, featuring Michael Kopp, Head of Digital at Keynote, and Rachel Opsler, VP Product Management, Mobile Testing, and Monitoring at Keynote. I'm your host and moderator, Josiah Renaud. Thank you for joining us today. Before I hand it off to the speakers, let me explain the controls in this console. If you experience any technical issues, please send a note through the question field located beneath the panels, and we'll be on hand to help as quickly as possible. Our responses can be read in the Q&A panel to the left of the slides. This is also the same way to submit questions. We welcome all comments and inquiries during today's event, so feel free to ask as many as you'd like, and we'll answer as many as possible during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. This event contains polling questions, which can be answered within the slide view. To optimize your bandwidth for the best viewing experience possible, please close out any unnecessary applications that may be running in the background. At the bottom of your console is a widget toolbar. These widgets open panels. The console opens with three on your screen: the speaker, Q&A, and the slide panels. All of these panels can be moved around and resized to your liking. If you accidentally close one, click the respective widget to reopen the panel in its original place. Hover the cursor over these icons to reveal labels identifying each widget. Through these icons, you can download the speaker's slides and share this event with friends and colleagues. This event is being recorded and will be made available for on-demand viewing. Once the recording is ready, you'll receive an email with instructions on how to access the presentation and slides on demand. With that said, I'd like to introduce and pass controls to our first speaker, Michael.
Hey there, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is a topic that is top of mind for a lot of people: agile development and mobile testing. And so, we've seen a lot of people attending today, so that's great. So, I want to get into the content. My name is Michael Kopp. I am the head of digital at Keynote. I run all the digital channels and marketing for the company. I'm just going to talk a little bit and set some context for you guys, and then hand it over to Rachel Opsler, who really is our expert and VP of Product Management. First off, thank you for attending today. A little bit about who Keynote is. So Keynote is a pioneer in mobile testing and monitoring. We've been around doing mobile testing for quite a while. We were one of the originators of it, kind of almost when there were mobile apps. Right? And that's really why we have some authority to talk on this topic. We have integrations with leading CI platforms if you are in an Agile environment. We have a wide range of solutions for mobile testing, thousands of fully interactive devices in our cloud, and a lot of top-level Fortune 1000 customers. So that's who we are, and that really just wanted to talk to you about this and get this out of the way. Just gives you the context of why we have authority in talking about this. So let's get into setting a little bit of the stage of why we are having this webcast. So as you guys all know, the mobile space, mobile app adoption, mobile is just growing at a infinite pace, really. According to the stats here, in 2015, there were over 226 billion apps expected to be downloaded, right? Billion downloads. That's a lot of downloads. But the bad news is that only 20% of those downloads of the apps are expected to be used more than once. So this sets a challenge not only in the app content and what the app is all about, but really in the overall quality and performance of that app. Some other useful stats are that only 16% of people are willing to give a poor quality, poor performing app more than one attempt, right? And that in general, just like we had with the web, the tolerance for poor performance also is low. So that 3 seconds of tolerance, I would actually argue it's much less than that for any digital interaction to load. So really what we have here is we have this great opportunity, and we have also a very fickle and very highly conscious of performance and quality customers who are looking at our apps and expect the apps to delight them and to do exactly what they expect to do, exactly when they expect to have it happen, right? So quality is paramount to that. Well, the other challenge that we're seeing is also that doing mobile app development across is very hard, right? The number of mobile devices is only growing. The fragmentation of the Android market, as visualized in this visualization, is doing nothing but growing, right? The number of the velocity of app updates, if you ever check your phone, I'm sure you guys are developing these things, but when I check my phone, I will see daily updates, if not hourly updates to my favorite apps coming all the time. So the pace has quickened, right? Growth, the market is growing, and the pace of updates has gone from months to weeks to days, right? So we're seeing this acceleration across the board, and I'm sure you guys are dealing with this. So that's why really Agile and mobile are a perfect match, right? It's like peanut butter and chocolate. It's like, milk and chocolate chip cookies. These things are great because they go together. They make perfect sense. Why is that? Well, with Agile development, you're able to react quickly to very changing environments and being able to iterate and test and iterate very quickly. And you really foster this cooperation between the entire development stream from development to testing to production. And this fast release cycle that you get into, especially around mobile, just really fits Agile to a T. And that's why we are having this webcast today on Agile and mobile testing as it fits into your entire Agile development process. So that's a little about where we are as far as the situation and about who we are. We'd like to know a little bit about you first. So we're going to ask just a poll question in general here. So of the mobile development projects that you are aware of or participating in at your company organization, what percentage use Agile methodologies? Okay? And let's bring on Rachel Opser. Rachel, are you there?
I am here.
Hey, welcome. So Rachel, do we use Agile development at Keynote at all?
We do, and it's interesting because I would say every team has implemented Agile in a different way. So just about, I think, almost all of our development is Agile in some form at this point, but some of them are kind of hybrid Agile, like it's kind of a cross between Waterfall and Agile. Some of them are more full Agile. I would say, though, almost all of them pick and choose the type of Agile methodologies that they want to use, so not everyone is using all Agile methodologies.
Interesting.
And I think, we'll find that we have some data that we're going to look at from a Forrester report that they did on Agile implementations, and so we'll see that that's pretty common across organizations, that sometimes there's a mix, and that, most organizations, when they implement Agile, pick and choose the types of things that they implement through Agile.
Okay, well, we've seen about 60% of you vote so far. We'll give you a couple more seconds to add your vote, and then we can move forward.
All right, 3 more seconds. And then last vote's coming in. Okay. And I'm going to show us the results. All right, so we've got a mix, which is not a big surprise. Actually, so we have about 12% saying they're not sure, but the biggest percentage, 37%, say 76 to 100% of their development projects are Agile or using some sort of Agile methodology. So that makes sense. That's the highest one. We see 16% saying over half to 75%. We have another 16% where a quarter to a half of the projects are Agile. And then about 19% say 0 to 25% are Agile. So it's a pretty equal mix, with the biggest percentage of people being in the 76 to 100% of projects being Agile. So let's actually look at some data that comes from Forrester on the same question. So this wasn't specifically asked about mobile. This was asked about Agile in general, but I still think it's interesting because it shows data over time. And it shows data from 2011, 2013, 2015, and what percent of organizations have implemented Agile. And so you can see here that clearly in 2015 you have a higher percentage of organizations that are using Agile. 24% are saying that 100% are using Agile. 24 plus 18 are saying between 75 and 100, a little bit higher than the poll we got, but in the poll we were asking about mobile. And I think Forrester also found that mobile is a little bit behind generally development projects. So, this makes sense and this is interesting, and I think the really important point to bring out here is that the world, most organizations are kind of in transition, right? So you can even see here that in 2011, you had 19% of people saying they were 100% Agile, then only 11% in 2013, and then 2015. And when I've talked to companies and even seen this in our own organization, Agile and implementing Agile is very seldomly, and I've actually never seen it be a completely smooth process. So a lot of times you move from waterfall to Agile, and it doesn't always go great in the beginning, and then you have to make adjustments and you have to make changes. And so, if you're sitting in the seat of still trying to kind of figure out what Agile means specifically for testing practices, what your Agile practice is ultimately going to look like, then that's okay, and that's where a lot of other organizations are right now. So if we look at then what's different specifically about testing in an Agile environment, now again, there are a lot of different types of Agile. So there are companies that are doing kind of a mix of waterfall and Agile, which is often called hybrid Agile. There's different types of Agile. There's Scrum, there's Kanban. But even though there's lots of different ways to implement Agile, I think there are some important commonalities that really work across almost all of them. And so one of them is faster release cycles. Now, this is pretty straightforward and obvious. I mean, this is one of the main reasons why Agile was even invented, was to be able to react to customer needs and deliver customer desired products and outcomes in a faster way. So what that means is that, where in the past you may have been seeing, say, 2 release cycles a year, most people are looking at maybe 12 release cycles a year. You're often doing sprints of 2 weeks. You may not be releasing every 2 weeks, but that you could be releasing every 2 weeks. So that's a pretty intense velocity increase, and that has a real impact on testing. So for instance, how much testing you have time for within a compacted schedule like that. So the second thing that's common across Agile practices is that all of them involve a much more integrated team. So what this really means is that this concept of throwing features over the wall doesn't or shouldn't happen. So testers are involved through all stages of the project, and they often play a much more prominent role in Agile development. So it may not be the traditional role that a QA team may have played, but it's an important role. So this makes sense, and it's important to understand here too that the role of Agile and the idea of Agile is not to get rid of the concept of testing. Some people, that's a misnomer that some people believe, but the idea of Agile is not to have no testing. The idea of Agile is to test more throughout the process and involve tests much earlier in the process, so that you're not doing this kind of waterfall method of you do all the development, you finally get a build that works, and only then do you hand it over to testing, and then they have to scramble to try to get it done as quickly as possible. And one of the reasons why Agile works this way is because of efficiency. The whole idea is that you don't want to wait to the end to find out that you have a problem, and then it's 3 months down the road, and the developer's forgotten what they've worked on, and they've lost context, and then it becomes very inefficient, handing back and forth between teams. The whole idea is to avoid handoffs and make things as smooth as possible. So the third thing that is common across a lot of Agile is having processes where test more drives the outcome. So some Agile implementations include things like test-driven development. It could be behavior-driven development, user acceptance testing-driven development. There's a couple of different ways that you can do it. But in all of them, the commonality is that you're really thinking about what you're trying to achieve up front and developing to that, and then ensuring that you've accomplished that task through your testing. So that gets really interesting. You can code a feature or user story based on the test that you need to pass, and that becomes a really high level of coordination between testing and development. So back to some of the Forrester studies, and this is all borne out in the data as well. So one thing that they saw is that testing and testers are largely peers to development, and they're first-class citizens of Agile teams. So this is a good thing that, on just about as many Agile teams as have a Scrum Master also have a tester involved. And this is what we want to see, that testers are key members of Agile teams. And then another piece of information from Forrester is looking at how often they're using in these Agile teams capabilities or processes like user acceptance, test-driven development, or just test-driven development. And you see that happening at a relatively high amount, that most teams are using some form of test-driven development in Agile. Okay, so now we've talked about some of the main differences of Agile and how that impacts testing. But what about mobile? How does mobile change how you test things? So first thing about mobile that's different than, say, desktop is faster release cycles again. So this one looks familiar. We've talked about it already. And Michael alluded to it earlier, that basically mobile pushes you to have much faster release cycles. Another thing that's different about mobile and more challenging is the software diversity that you have to deal with. So you have two major platforms, probably soon to be a third major platform with Windows 10 coming out, and a lot of variation between them as well. So, Android, because it's an open platform, means that different companies can customize it, and that creates differences that you have to test across. And along with those software differences, there's also hardware differences. So this is a consumer electronic product, and that means that companies are incented to make flashy phones, things that people want to buy, create differentiation. And beyond that, users do things on a phone that they just don't do in a computer. It's a completely mobile device. You move it around, you turn it around, you use the accelerometer functionality. You touch the screen all the time. Computers will get there at some point, but most computers right now, you're still using a mouse. So there are differences in the way the hardware works and consumers interact with the hardware and the software in mobile that makes it different and more challenging. And back to the Forrester study, we also see that Agile is of top importance for mobile, and that makes sense. So we've identified some things that are challenging about mobile, and Agile really meets those needs to be able to deliver things more quickly. And so it makes sense that people say, well, the most important area for me to do Agile development is mobile. Okay, so now we've talked about Agile in general and how that impacts test, and we talked about mobile and the differences in mobile. And so we've identified some differences, which is the faster release cycles, integrated teams, and early participation of tests. That test can often drive the outcome, that there's software diversity that impacts, and also hardware matters as well. So what do these differences really mean for the test process? And so there are a number of things that are required to really deal with these differences. One of them is automation. And this is probably not going to be a surprise for most people on the line. Automation is important in testing whether you're actually using an Agile process or not. Agile just makes it even more important because you're trying to meet much faster timelines. And the same thing with mobile. Mobile makes it even more important because you're dealing with a greater diversity of platform. And so to be able to test across platforms, you need to be able to automate and speed up your test process. So one of the other things that is really important to do and understand is that even though we say automation is required, manual testing still plays a role. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that even if you automate all you possibly can, you're never going to get to the point. It's unrealistic to get to a point where you've automated 100% of your tests. So there will still be some amount of manual testing. And now the second reason is that with Agile, and even with mobile, the user experience is very important. You're trying to get to market with something that customers want and delights them. And so testing capabilities or testing processes like exploratory testing or negative testing really testing from the point of view of the user becomes more important. So while manual testing, the amount of it may go down as you start to automate, you can focus on more high-value types of testing, like really testing from the user's point of view. So the next area is continuous integration. And the concept of Agile, of course, is that you don't break the build. So because you're building more and more often, probably at least once a day in the concept of Agile, it's really key to have a continuous integration process that includes automatically running through a series of build acceptance tests on each build. And next one is testers and developers collaborating and sharing test responsibility. So as I mentioned before, the whole idea of waterfall, and one of the reasons why a lot of companies are moving to Agile, is it's more efficient because you involve tests in the beginning and because you don't have these awkward handoffs between two groups that requires a lot of churning. You hand a finished feature over to test, you find out there's a problem, you hand it back. It may go back 2 weeks to months after you've actually finished the development, you've lost context. It creates a lot of inefficiency. So it's key here to enable testers and developers to collaborate together, and I'll talk about some ways that you can do that more effectively. And then lastly, access to real devices. So again, because of the software diversity, because hardware matters in this case, through the testing process, it's really important to be able to test on the actual platforms that your users are going to use to the extent possible. And so having a really easy way to access real devices is key. So with that, I'm going to talk about now the various types of testing that one can do, and then how those different strategies kind of work into these various stages of testing. And I'm actually going to go kind of backwards. I'm going to start with exploratory testing and then go down through regression, build, and then to unit. And the reason why I'm doing that is because sometimes in latter stages of testing, it's made easier based on what you do in earlier stages. And so as we go through the later stages, we'll identify the requirements of the earlier stages to make the later stages easier to do. All right, so let me start with exploratory testing. So as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to test from the point of view of a user. And as Michael talked about earlier, why is that? Well, because it's really easy to delete an app off of a phone. So you want to make sure people have a good experience, and to do that, you really need to put yourself into the place of the user. So one of the things that's really important to do as a user is to test on a real device. And you don't have to test on every device, but it's really important first to understand which devices your users are using. And there's a lot of ways to get that data. Most apps at this point, or a lot of them, have marketing analytics products inside of them. So you can get access to the actual breakdown of what users, what OSs, what phones people are accessing your app from. Now, if you don't have access to that data, you can ask your marketing team, but if you can't get access to that data, or if it's the first launch of your product and so you don't know, you can look at what's just popular in the market, or Keynote, for instance, can help with this. We've worked with a lot of customers to help them come up with a device testing strategy so that you get a really good cross-section of devices. You don't have to test on every device, but you get a good cross-section of different OS versions, different resolutions of screens, different features, so that you get a good cross-section of devices out there. So the second thing that's important here, so test on real devices, but where you can, use real devices in the cloud. And there's a couple of reasons for that, and most of it is around convenience. If you look at that little box of devices there, and you see there's some old devices in there too, we've worked with lots of customers that literally this is what they have. They have somewhere a box of devices, and when they want to check on a device, they go to the box, they check something out. They may have devices, everyone has some devices at their desk, but managing devices like this is kind of a pain. Most organizations, especially with the advent of bring your own device, most of them don't have a function which is someone who orders new devices, gets plans on devices, manages devices for a team. So, it's a difficult thing to manage. And so if you can, instead of using your own device, using a box of devices, but just get on the cloud and get access to whatever devices you need, that's very convenient, and it's a much easier way to make sure that you can test on the real devices that you need. So the other thing that's really important for exploratory testing or negative testing, really this, again, testing like a user, is to offload the manual testing efforts to the extent that you can. And so of the other types of testing I'm going to talk about today, really all of them can get some level of automation. So, offload, build acceptance tests, regression tests, unit tests, do as much automation as you can. Even if you can't automate everything, even a small amount of automation is going to help and be really valuable. Think that what often happens is that QA or testing can be a bottleneck. And so as a result, you want to automate, but you don't have time to automate because testing is a bottleneck and they have to test. So you really have to figure out how to set aside time to be able to do automation, because until you get out of that catch-22, you're always going to be in the same situation where testing is always a bottleneck because you don't have enough time to test. All right, so we'll look at some more data from the Forrester study. And so here, what we're seeing too is what level of automation are companies doing. And so you can see here that the numbers are ranging from 53% to 30%. So on average, most companies are not getting 80% automation or 70% automation. And while that may be a good goal, even some amount of automation, 30%, even 20%, will really make a big impact to your testing. All right. So now we're going to talk about regression testing and the best practices here. So the first thing to talk about is that in regression testing, the typical way before Agile was to run through these huge regressions of basically every feature and functionality that you have. Now, in a 2-week cycle, there's really just no way to do that. Agile practice means that the idea of testing has to change. And so the first thing that's really important is to be much smarter about what areas of the system may be impacted and what regressions are really required. All of testing is about risk, and so you have to figure out how to manage your risk and think really intelligently about what set of regressions do we need to do. Okay, so let's assume that you've thought that through and you know what set of regressions you need to do. So what's the next thing that you can do? Well, the second is obviously to automate wherever you can. And so how do you do that? How do you think about this? Well, the first one is if you can get, and there are those out in the market, and Keynote has one as well, a real device automation tool that enables cross-device testing. That's the most important and basic building block to being able to automate mobile testing. So what this means is that you can write a script. It'll run across devices. It works at the object level. So that means it's looking for objects in the actual code of an application. And the reason why that's important is because it means it's faster to write tests and it requires a lot less maintenance. I think one of the biggest issues in automation programs, and those of you in the testing world for a long time will totally understand this, that you put a lot of effort in up front to creating an automation program, but all of them require maintenance. And sometimes that's where it falls down because people get tired of doing the maintenance. They want it to run perfectly every time, and there's always maintenance required really for every release. So the trick is to minimize that maintenance, and when you have an object-level scripting capability, when a small change happens to the UI, it's not going to impact your regression tests. They will continue to run because the object at its core is still there. Okay, so after the real device automation tool, the next thing to think about is what else does your testers need? So who is going to be writing this automation? What skills do they have, and what tools do they work within? They may have been working for years and years on desktop automation, and they're familiar with using HP tools like UFT or QTP. They may like to write tests in Appium. They may be very good programmers. They may be new. They may need something like a recorder where they can just point and click on a device, and that will create a script for them because they're really just getting up to speed with the whole idea of automation. So understanding kind of what are the skill sets of your employees is really important to choosing a tool that's going to work and be adopted. The other thing that's good to understand too is what other tools are in the ecosystem that maybe you need to work within. You may have processes like requirements management processes or bug tracking processes that you want this tool to integrate with. So important to understand the ecosystem and the skill sets so that you get a tool that will work within your existing processes to the extent possible and have high user adoption. And then lastly, if your development team is using some sort of test-driven practice, and they're writing their own unit tests, and presumably they're automating them, or at least automating some of them, then it's important to think about a tool set where developers and testers can both collaborate and contribute to it. So one example here is, let's say there's a developer that's writing a unit test. They've automated a unit test, and they've run it on a real device. Well, maybe next time around, someone in the testing organization can use what they've done. Maybe they have to edit it, but maybe they can use what they've done as part of a regression test in the next release. The other reason is, let's say that someone is running a test, a tester's testing something, and they find a problem. Well, if they can pass back what device they used, to the developer, and the developer has the same access to that device to be able to reproduce it very easily, it makes the process much more smooth. Okay, so now we're at the second poll, and this is actually the last poll too, so those who want to vote, this is your chance. And the question is, of your organization's mobile development projects, doesn't matter if they're Agile or not, but of their projects, what percentage of regression testing is automated? So since we've just been talking about regression tests. So we'll let everyone fill out, and we'll give people a couple seconds to fill it out here. And, one thing to keep in mind here, too, is that I mentioned this before, that it's always a huge struggle to spend time in a given release to automate, largely because you have to do testing as well. So it's really important to set aside resources for this purpose. And then the other thing to think about, too, is that even if you're in the process of moving to Agile, you haven't gone to Agile yet, even in Waterfall, it's really important and helpful to automate. Automation is just a way to, offload manual testers so that they can do more high-value testing like exploratory testing, and also just make it much quicker to run through a series of tests faster. So we'll give another 10 seconds. It looks like we already have 59% of people voting, so we'll see if anyone has any last votes left out there that they want to make. Got a couple more. All right, 3 more seconds for the last vote. Okay, and I'm going to see what the results are. All right, so this is not a huge surprise either. So what we see here is, of mobile development projects, about 57, so over half of the respondents have done 0 to 25% of automation. And then we have about 20% that has done 26 to 50%. We have 10 respondents, so 9% of people who have done over half to 75% of automation, which is great. And then we have a small percentage that's done between 76 and 100%, which is excellent. So we see that most organizations, or a lot of organizations, are starting to automate, but there's still a lot that haven't gotten very far with automation yet, which again is not a surprise. I mean, mobile is still relatively early in the cycle, and it takes some time to get to the automation. And as I mentioned, there's always this kind of resource constraint and issue of we need to test, but if we could automate, we'd be more effective testing, but we don't have time to automate because we need to get a release out the door. So that's something that you have to manage within your organization and try to put the time in to do the automation. Okay, so let's move to build acceptance testing. Build acceptance testing, the important thing here, whether you're using Jenkins, another build tool, is to make sure that you do some automated testing around your build. And you're probably creating new builds at least daily in Agile, could be more often. And just a small set of automated tests that make sure basic functionality is there is really important. I mean, one reason is it'll keep your QA team happy because no one in testing likes to go start testing a build that's just broken. It's really just a waste of everyone's time. The other thing is, as I mentioned earlier, that anytime you have a reverse handoff, so every time you hand something to a tester and then they have to hand it back to development, it's just a waste of time. So the extent to which you can avoid or minimize those reverse handoffs, you're going to be more and more efficient. There's a lot of tools out there that allow users to write a set of automated tests that work across devices that can be triggered on a build. One example is shown here. So Keynote has an integration with Jenkins. And so you can really easily just automatically load your app to a set of devices, could be a small set of devices, maybe one Android, one iOS, and then automatically trigger a number of tests to run on those devices and then pull back results so you know that your build was successful. Even this small amount of automation can save a huge amount of time. I had worked with a customer and they were doing their build acceptance testing manually. And it was a little bit of an extreme case, but it was interesting. They had about 30 test cases, which I think is a lot for build acceptance, but that was their requirement. And they were testing 30 test cases across 2 different devices, so one Android and one iOS. And it was taking about 24 hours for the development team to get feedback, largely because the manual testers, I mean, they had other things that they had to do too, so it typically took a while to get that feedback. And what they did with our tool is they were able to automate that set of testing to automatically kick off those tests. And after they did that, the development team is now getting feedback within an hour. So it really makes a huge difference, especially if you have a 2-week sprint, to be able to give feedback immediately within half an hour, like a really quick period of time on a build, as opposed to waiting a whole day, because then you lose a whole day if you have a problem. All right, and then lastly, I'm going to talk about unit testing. So a couple important points I want to make about unit testing. So the first is development unit tests. So what I mean by that is the developer should be doing unit testing on what they develop. And then the second thing I'll talk about is testing on real devices. So why is it important for the developer to perform unit testing? So there's a lot of talk, and many of you are probably familiar with the idea that the later you are in the process where you identify an issue, the more expensive it is to fix it. And so certainly that's true identifying something in production versus in test, and a lot of people talk about like a 3 to a 10x cost multiple of waiting till production versus identifying in the testing phase. But it's even still more expensive to wait till you get to test as opposed to fixing it in development. And again, it's that issue of handoff that you're trying to reduce. So handoffs always take time. They're just by nature of them inefficient. Agile makes them much more efficient. So, in Agile, let's say a developer finishes a feature and hands it off to a tester. Well, maybe that tester gets through it and can give it back to them within a day if there's an issue. But even that day, you lose some context. So it makes a lot more sense for the developer to find that issue. And when they're writing their own unit tests and running their own unit tests, it's not actually inefficient from a development point of view, because if they hand something off to QA or testing, tester finds an issue, they hand it back to the developer has to reproduce and fix it anyway. So if they had done that initially on their own, they won't have wasted any time and cycles of the tester or just time in terms of the 2-week sprint. So the second thing, testing on real devices. So why is it important to test on real devices? Well, there's nothing wrong with testing on an emulator, but if it's easy enough, and it is nowadays, to take your app and quickly put it on a real device and test on a real device, that's always going to be better. And the reason is because there are things that are different about real devices than what you're going to get in an emulator. Lots of different devices have different screen resolutions, screen sizes. It may make things appear odd if images haven't been sized or resized appropriately, or controls can sometimes fall off a screen, or you have a certain set of things that you intend to show up and have visible on the screen that may be under the fold. Android has a lot of customizations. You have both on-screen and physical controls, and there are not that many buttons on a phone nowadays, but even those buttons often have differences in what they actually do. And they can differ across devices and also differ between the emulator and devices. And then lastly, it's just a good way to check if you have a memory or CPU issue with your application. So you throw it on a real device and something like that will become immediately apparent. So again, it's not required to test on real devices in the unit testing phase, but it's very easy to do it nowadays, and so it's really recommended to do that where it's easy, because if it's easy enough, there's no reason not to, and you're going to get better information earlier in the process. And again, Agile, a lot of it is about shifting work that you're doing to the left, right? The earlier you can do something in the process without wasting a lot of time, then you're going to save a lot of time later in the process. And those are the things that really enable you to get releases out in a much more rapid basis. And I'm going to show one quick example of something we've done with a partner. So Keynote did an integration with SAP where if you have an app in their HANA cloud system, you can really quickly just say, I want to put this on a real device. We'll automatically grab the app, throw it on a device, launch the app. You don't have to do anything except choose the device that you want to put it on. And so there's an app on a device, and you could then start to test it really easily. So with integrations like this, there's really no reason not to do unit testing even on a real phone. All right, so now we've gone through various stages, testing stages, and talked about different best practices that have to do with the 5 key things that I mentioned earlier on. So 1, to automate whatever you can, because that's always going to speed your process. To still pay attention to manual testing, how you do manual testing and where it plays a big role, because number 1, you'll never be able to automate everything, and that's okay. At some point, there's diminishing returns of automating things that are very difficult to automate. And second, because manual testing is really useful for the only way really you can do things like exploratory testing or negative testing, that testing where you really put yourself in the place of the user. Continuous integration, so that's probably the most important place there is for automating and making sure that you can, every time you produce a new build, that you can just validate that there's nothing really wrong with the build. That having an environment and a way for testers and developers to collaborate and share the burden or the job of testing is really important. So making sure that developers do their unit testing and that testers and developers both have access to real devices to do testing. And then again, access to real devices. So maybe the most important thing here is making it really easy for your developers, your testers, everyone in your team to be able to access real devices in the cloud so that you can test on the actual environment that your users are going to be using. So and with that, if you would like to try out the Keynote product set, you can very easily do so on our website. We happily will do demos of our products anytime. We have manual testing, automated testing, all that good stuff. And it can be found at www.keynote.com. And with that, I think we're opening it up for questions.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you very much, guys. Before we start Q&A, remember you can ask Rachel and Michael questions by typing them in the field beneath the panel and then clicking the Submit button. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible, but for any that we don't get to now, some will be answered offline. All right, so let's start right over here. This person would like to know, should we manual test, then automate, or just start directly with automation?
So I'm guessing that question is kind of around like, a new feature. And so it really depends. I mean, I think it depends if you have a new feature, and if you're talking unit testing, if you're talking a little bit farther down the road. If it's, I guess the easiest way to say it is if it's easy to automate, absolutely automate. But if it's something that's going to be difficult to automate, you get, again, diminishing returns from automation. You're spending more time automating than you would have spent testing it 10 times, then it doesn't make sense in that case to automate. So you really have to look at the feature, the capability, and then think about it and say, if I can automate this, I should, but if it's hard to do it, it's okay to do some manual testing. You're never going to get away from manual testing entirely.
All right, thank you very much. This person would like to know, is it common for testers to share their automation scripts with developers so that they can use them for the unit or assembly testing?
So I would not say I've seen that it's common. I've talked with many customers about it and the idea of doing it, and it's something that everyone wants to do, that a tester could create a bunch of automated scripts and be able to share that with the development team so that they could use it whenever they want. So I think it's a good thing to do, but it's something that I would not say yet is common in practice, although I think, most teams would like to get there.
All right, next question here. This person would like to know, for their mobile device strategy, should they be testing a device or the operating system?
So you actually have to think about both things. Now with, let me use iOS as an example. So for iOS, you could have a device, let's say it's the iPhone 6, and it could be on a couple different OS versions. And so I mentioned earlier it's important to understand like who are your users and what they're using. So if you look at the profile of your users and you see, for instance, that 60% of the iOS 6 users are on iOS 9, but 40 or 30% are on iOS 8, then in that situation, you're testing on one physical device or one type of hardware, but you may need to test on two versions of OS for that one type of hardware. So that's two devices, one on one OS version, one on the other. So there's cases where you're going to be testing for the physical device, and there's cases where you have to also test different OSs on the same physical device. And it just depends, again, on your user profile and what you're seeing.
All right, thank you very much. Next one here. This person says that they didn't see any load or performance testing in the list of testing. Was that covered in any of the existing testing categories?
Yeah, I did not admittedly cover every single type of testing that you can do, so I decided in this presentation to focus on those and not necessarily talk about load. And in fact, we did a webinar a couple months back where we talked a little bit more about load. So I don't mean to ignore it. Load testing is certainly another important type of testing as well. I just didn't happen to cover it here.
All right, thanks for that clarification. This person asked, does Keynote support hybrid apps?
Yes. So the Keynote system is actually based on real devices, and so what that means is you can do anything on it that you could do on a real device. So you can test a mobile website, you can test a hybrid app, you can test a native app. It really doesn't make a difference.
All right. Next question. What's a good goal for the percentage of regression tests automated for mobile apps?
So, as I mentioned earlier, any amount of automation you do is always going to be positive. I think that if you're going to set a goal, don't be too aggressive to begin with. Set a goal that you think you can achieve. Look through your set of tests. Do some analysis of what you think is easily automatable versus difficult to automate. I think, for instance, 50% is a fantastic goal. If you can automate 50% of your tests, imagine how much manual testing and how much time you could save. Now, ultimately, you probably want to be able to get up to, say, 70%, but I would not set that as an initial goal if you're just starting out automation. I would set my sights much lower because even, again, 30%, if that's the first phase of something, is going to give you a huge benefit.
All right. And this person also wants to know, so how many devices are enough to test on?
So that's also a very difficult question. Just like regression testing and figuring out which regression tests you have to run through is kind of a management of risk, deciding how many devices to test on is also a management of risk. And so, looking at, again, your device profile, like what users are using, which OS versions are they on, what hardware versions are they on, and seeing where the highest percent of your users are. At some point, you have to kind of decide that you're on a long tail, and you're going to take the risk that you've done enough testing that that long tail of other devices that people are using are probably going to be okay. So again, it's a risk profile. Now, when we talk to customers, I would say we typically end up somewhere between like 10 and 20 different devices. And again, it depends on the customer's profile of users, and it depends on their risk profile. And customers that are much more risk averse will want to test on more devices, and customers that are a little less risk averse can test on less devices.
All right, we have a lot of good questions coming in. This person wanted to ask, so web browser applications versus native applications. Is it sort of the same strategy when you're testing and kind of trying to work with these different applications?
So I'm sorry, web versus?
Web versus native.
Native. Yep. So, I mean, the nice thing about web is that you typically can write scripts that work across Android and iOS, and the website or the web app is really the same regardless of what platform you're on. But other than that, when it comes down to it, you're testing on a real device. You need to make sure everything looks right and works on a real device. So in terms of the actual test process, it's not really that different.
All right, and we have a little bit of a longer question here. So this person asks, when do you decide to have dedicated automation testers for iOS and Android? Does it depend on the size of the app or the revenue of the business? And when would you recommend something like Appium over Espresso and UI testing?
Okay, that's an interesting, difficult question to answer too. I think that probably a number of different things, as the asker indicated, would go into deciding whether or not you want to have a dedicated tester assigned to iOS versus Android. One of it would be the size and the amount of testing, right? So how much testing needs to get done and how many resources do you need? So if you need 5 total resources, it's probably much easier to designate or assign some of them to iOS and some of them to Android than if you needed 1 within the course of the sprint. So that's one. I think also it probably depends somewhat on how different your application is when it's on Android versus iOS. I've certainly seen some customers where iOS was actually developed in-house, but Android was outsourced or vice versa. And so in that case, you really probably have a very different structure of the application. And so having one person test both, you probably don't gain much from that. So it makes more sense to separate out the resources. they may both be developed internally, but by completely different teams. You may have a different release cycle for both of them, right? So, in those cases, it probably makes more sense to potentially separate. You don't have to have the same person doing both. I don't know if I answered the whole question. There was another part of the question at the end.
Yeah, that seemed like the majority of it. They had mentioned the
Okay.
the difference between using Appium over Espresso and UI testing, but I think you covered most of it.
Yeah, I mean, so Appium is great because it does allow you to write a script that runs on both, iOS and Android, as long as your app is largely the same. We have a lot of customers that use Appium. It seems to be kind of a tool of choice at this point. So, so I think Appium is good. Certainly it's something that we've integrated with, so you can take Appium scripts, you can run them on our devices because, like I said, it seems to be a really great tool of choice especially for developers nowadays.
All right, we have time for just a few more questions. So this person asked, do you have any specific examples, whether it be with your customers or someone on your team, that really showcase how Keynote technology can improve testing?
So I don't have anything in this slide deck. I mean, I talked about one actually in the slide deck, which was the example of the customer that automated their continuous integration and went from, it taking 24 hours to give any feedback to the development team to basically being able to do it within an hour. So that's a great example. Anytime that you can automate your build acceptance test, it's going to make a huge difference, especially with something like Agile and really compressing timelines to getting feedback back on your build or testing is really important. And so one of the things that that Keynote allows you to do, and I didn't talk about this too much during the presentation either, but it gives you lots of different ways to create scripts. So, I talked a lot about how important automation was, so we make it as easy as possible because we have a recorder, so someone who's not familiar with automating could just point and click on a device and create a script. We have the ability to write scripts in Java. We have the ability to integrate with other tool sets like QTP. You can run Appium scripts on our devices. So, those are some of the ways that we make it really easy for customers to be able to test on real devices by giving them lots of different tools so that whatever they're comfortable with, they can integrate into their process.
All right, thank you very much. And we do have a few more questions here, but a lot of these will be answered offline. That's actually all the time that we're going to have for today. So I'd like to thank our speakers, Michael and Rachel, for their time. I'd like to thank Keynote for sponsoring this event. Also, a special thank you goes out to you, the audience, for spending the last hour with us. Have a great day. We hope to see you at a future event.